at the French Ministry of Economy, Mr. Stefano Montanari, Advisor to the Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights, and last but not least, Mr. Tobias Schmidt, Commissioner for European Affairs of the German Media Authorities and the former chair of ERGA. And Tobias, if that's okay, I would like to start with you. You've been following the negotiations very closely. And looking ahead at 2022, are there any other main aspects of the text which weren't discussed and should need to be improved by the co-legislators during the interinstitutional negotiations, in your opinion?
So, hello. First of all, hello to everybody, and thanks for having me. It's of course a pleasure, and even if it's, again, only virtual, I think it's a good opportunity to have an exchange about this interesting topic. And as you already said, I think it's the right moment as we are now in front of the trilogue for the DSA. Yeah, good question. As you already said, in my main function, I'm head of a regulatory authority in Germany. It's North Rhine-Westphalia. For everyone who's interested in the federal structure of Germany, I can explain it later on for about 3 hours. But before that, in my main function, of course, I'm responsible for the European affairs and, as you said, member of the ERGA board. And from our perspective, the upcoming discussion about the DSA, I think, should be used to adjust some aspects that we have. And this is why I think, first of all, and here I think we all have a kind of a common agreement or common ground. Of course, it's a good idea to find rules for the online environment and activities. And I think also that Europe is a good body to do so. This also because maybe we are in Europe used to find this compromise between market and freedom on the one hand and regulatory environment on the other to protect some core values of population. But nevertheless, and this seems to me or to us the remaining main challenge out of the DSA is, the DSA in some areas, or we have two weaknesses. The first is in some areas it's not really that concrete. So if you ask me as an executive body later on to execute this DSA, I've got to say, yeah, good idea, but I do not exactly what I've got to do. And that's normally not the best beginning. And the second point is, from our perspective, ERGA's perspective, and beside the general support to this idea, we've got to say maybe the DSA is delivering solutions for problems that don't exist. I try to explain it, and maybe then we can also find in the discussion solutions for this point. The whole idea of the regulatory environment of the DSA, especially in our area, the media area, starts from a point where the Commission says we need a pan-European solution and we need a cross-sectoral solution. Yeah, good idea. But, from our perspective, from the practical perspective and experience, 99% of all of our cases are neither pan-European nor cross-sectoral. We have European issues, but these issues or problems or cases are normally bilateral, sometimes trilateral, so that you have an involvement or some content addressing your population in member state 1, and the content comes from member state B or 2, and maybe the platform is sitting in member state C or island. But at the end, you normally have 3 and normally 2 member states involved, and nearly never 27. So that's why the complexity of structure that the DSA is developing is maybe too much, and at the end it's something that works against a higher efficiency of regulation. And the same is the topic with the cross-sectoral approach. As you all know, the DSA is a very ambitious project to find a cross-sectoral and holistic solution for all areas. And of course, I like this idea as an abstract idea. But again, coming to reality, I've got to say, as a media regulator, again, 99.9 to 100% of our cases are no cross-sectoral cases. The cross-sectoral issues, of course, that we have are normally issues or problems for legislators. So to find the right line between competition law and media law, between telecommunication and data protection, and so on, is for sure complicated. But from the moment on where the rules are written, the law is ready, for us as executive bodies, it's normally not a big issue. So in my authority, we have a lot of cases, also cross-border cases, but our experience is, as I said, normally bilateral cases, and normally cases, they are very clearly located in the so-called media law area. Human dignity, protection of minors, protection of consumers because of advertisement, or questions of pluralism. So that's why I'm afraid, or we are afraid, that the DSA has a very ambitious starting point, and we understand it from an abstract point of view, but in the concrete way, this very ambitious starting point could be also a burden. And that's why, from my side, and coming back to your question, I think the most important change in the last weeks around the DSA is the so-called Article 69, where the Parliament says maybe it could be a good idea for the Digital Services Act to take in respect that we have already existing structures for regulation, and that the DSA should take these structures and use it a bit more. And this could be an answer for the questions of efficiency, as I said, effectiveness, another point also important, and last point, independency. Because of course the structure we have now, and we can talk about it later on with the Digital Services Board and the Digital Services Coordinators and so on, at the end leads, as we all know, just to one institution deciding every important thing. And this is the European Commission. And the European Commission is for sure one of the most competent and fantastic institutions I know, but it's not independent. And the idea of regulation should be an independent one. And let's make me just this last point. When I take a look on, and maybe that's also important from your point of view, you know, in the combination between the structure, the governance structure on the one hand, and the lack of concrete measures on the other hand, it leads to an additional question, and this is something between the industry and us. To be very open, I do not exactly understand what the idea of a regulation out of this DSA should be at the end. Is it self-regulation? Is it co-regulation? Is it hybrid regulation? Or is it regulation? And I think if the DSA don't deliver better answers to that, then it will generate an insecureness. Because, and this has got to be very clear, I know for all of you it is clear, but sometimes I have the impression not every politician has realized it. The DSA is a directive, and that means this is the end of legislation for this area. And if you take the DSA, like for example, Article 8 to 12, you've got to say, yeah, interesting, but if you read it, then you have more the impression that it is more something like a directive, you know, where someone hopes that then comes a more concrete rule after it, but I can't see it. So that's why, let's come to an end for this. I'm so sorry for this long answer. I think the DSA is a good idea. It is the right body to do so, to come with something like this from Europe, but we need, or there is a need to use the upcoming discussion in the trilogue to find answers for the question, how could we take care of an effective protection of population? How could we find an answer for an efficient structure? How could we find a good answer for the balanced system between regulation, co-regulation, and self-regulation? And how could we guarantee an independency? Sounds like a lot of points, and I know that at the end of a trilogue there's not so much room for maneuvers, but at the end it's not so complicated if there is a political will. And from ERGA's side, I can say, of course, we are willing to support this solution as far as it is needed. And if there comes up a structure that works, then of course we also will fill it out. So thanks a lot for giving me this 5 to 7 minutes.
Thanks, Tobias. I would like to actually ask the same question to you, Stefano. In a nutshell, what do you take from the past discussion? How do you see the future discussion and the future content regulation?
Thank you, Alexander. And I think after Tobias' comments, there's little more that can be said. I mean, his answer has been precise, has raised the right points. I think I agree that it's very difficult to give a short answer to such a complex text, and the complexity and the impact that this text will have on users, on citizens, but also on regulatory bodies, which in the end will be those probably who will have to add this role to what they are already doing. So in the Commissioner's Office at the Council of Europe, we have dealt with many of the topics that are in the DSA already in 2014 with some recommendations. I think one of the challenges for this trilogue, I mean, there are many challenges, and as Tobias said, in the end, there is little that, I mean, there will be words which will change and they have a legal importance, but I think there are so many points that still are unclear that I'm not sure that this trilogue will be able to solve all the conflicts, all the issues. For example, the issue of journalistic content, which has been adopted through editorial rigor. I know that now the Parliament hasn't accepted the media exemption, which is a good thing. But again, in practice, how do you ensure that editorial content produced by journalists is not subjected to editorial content by private companies like Facebook, Google, etc.? What are the safeguards that you are going to introduce into that? But also another point is how to synchronize the international and national jurisprudence on these issues, on the implementation of the DSA, because there are, for example, there's content which is illegal in a country, not in another. Another issue is how to deal with the fact that many of these companies are based in the United States, where we have a different jurisprudence. The Supreme Court in the United States will take different decisions in respect to the case that is adjudicated by the German Federal Court, for example. So there are many issues, and I'm not sure that the trilogue will be able to solve them. From the Council of Europe perspective, I think we have done a lot of work on content moderation. There are guidelines. Of course, these guidelines don't have the power of an act, so they are more soft law instruments. But I think it would be good to refer to those standards in the Council of Europe and try to harmonize a little bit the DSA, the safeguards that they are going to be introduced with human rights safeguards that the Council of Europe has put forward. So there's a lot to say, and I'm afraid that the time that we have today would be not sufficient for that. But I fully subscribe to what Tobias was saying, because this is also part of the reflection in the Council of Europe discussions.
Thank you. Mathieu, the French presidency has a very ambitious goal, the goal to make the discussions advance as much as possible in the upcoming month. Can you share us a bit about the vision and the ambition of the French presidency for this text, please?
Thank you very much, Alexandra. I'm really delighted to be here and sharing at this precise moment where a lot of progress has been made, and obviously there are a few topics, and I'd love to jump into a debate about some of the arguments we've heard so far. And obviously, I will have to refrain, considering the position of the presidency, where we are obviously bound by our mandate, and the discussions take place in the trilogues. We all know the system, but it's important to note that for us, we're still listening to everything that's going on outside of the trilogue as well. We think it's very important to keep in touch with all the stakeholders, and the DSA is a text that has very broad implications in very large areas, and we're very aware of the responsibility to move this forward. And actually, I think the first thing I would say is that it's amazing we're here. It's amazing the progress that's been made in the last few months. First, about the concept of this text, and I think we all should not forget how much progress has been made in acknowledging first that there is a responsibility for a number of platforms. There's content moderation. There's obviously other types of intermediaries, such as the marketplaces, and the DSA is a horizontal framework. It goes beyond content moderation, although we tend to focus on the topic because it's a very important issue in our daily lives. But I think it was high time this text comes. It was presented, and less than a year, actually a year after it was introduced, we'll be entering the trilogues in the next few days. Not many stakeholders were betting on this. So the kudos to the Commission, kudos to the previous presidency, especially the Slovenian presidency for advancing, kudos to the European Parliament, where they made outstanding work in making progress. And of course, there are topics that might not be completely settled, that might feel not clear enough, especially if you're a practitioner. I guess, I mean, in lawmaking, there's always this kind of compromise, and we'll do our best during the trilogues to provide as much clarity as possible, obviously. So I think my first point is really that as Europeans, we should all rejoice about the fact that it's been acknowledged that there's an issue and that Europe is the right scale to deal with it. And I think this is absolutely essential, because we know that each individual European country does not have, none of the countries, whether it's Germany, whether it's Ireland, whether it's Slovakia, whatever, none of us, we have the leverage to keep the platforms, especially the largest ones, accountable to what should be their responsibility. And so Europe is the right scale, and that's an important aspect that we should not lose sight of. Obviously, we're all focusing on what remains to be done, but I want to remind ourselves that there has been made great progress. And this progress has been made by keeping, I think, some of the key pillars for Europe, and especially for Euro-ISPA members. One of it is the principles from the e-commerce directive, the liability regime, the prohibition of general monitoring, all of this being preserved. I think this was a key concern by some when we entered the discussion, and this is preserved in the versions that are currently on the table. So we are adding a new layer of accountability for certain players, but without destabilizing the existing framework. This is quite important. The second part, which I think the DSA is bringing, which is positive, is the fact that it's a graduated approach, and the burden, the regulatory burden that is being added is proportionate to the size, to the type of players, and this is also quite a new approach, and I think it's an important aspect, and nobody's challenging it right now. And finally, for every market player, the DSA is a significant step to a more harmonized single market, digital single market. We all know there are a number of rules that have been passed by several countries regarding content moderation, for instance. And so we are setting the stage for a more level playing field across Europe for everyone to have clarity, visibility, and so for European players to grow without having to adjust to 27 different legislative frameworks. So I think this really is the key things for us. Obviously, as you said, we'll try our best to go as far as possible during the French presidency of the Council, depending, and we're setting very aggressive timelines of discussion with the Parliament. At least we are, I mean, fully committed to be there, to be in Brussels as often as necessary, whatever the health conditions, whether it rains or snows or like rarely does anything else in Brussels anyway. We'll be there. We'll try to advance the mandate from the Council, and we're very encouraged by the recent vote by the Parliament. I think there's very good atmosphere. Everyone's engaged to make this happen quickly, but also without sacrificing quality. So everything that we need to clarify, we will do our best to do so.
Thank you very much, Mathieu. I would like to get back to a point raised earlier by Tobias on the powers of digital services coordinators and the issue linked to actually enforcing the text. And my first question would actually go to Stefano in terms of how do you think that member states could ensure the correct capacity building to take into account fundamental rights aspects in the implementation of the text?
Well, I think in terms of digital and the DSA coordinators, I think it is still unclear how they will be, functioning, what kind of expertise they will have, how to make sure that they will work. To me, the key point there is to ensure that there is accountability of their work as well. Apart from the evidence that they have to be experts on the matter, but they must be also accountable of what they are doing. It's a complex situation in which you have media regulatory bodies, you have ombudsmen as well who could work on this issue and provide that kind of oversight. I think there is another aspect which is important to take into account is to what extent countries can use constitutional law to ensure that constitutional rights are also respected while implementing the DSA. There's a field of studies in this issue, but I think there's no one single solution. I think Mathieu expressed very well that this is an issue that goes beyond one single country. And the more cooperation and discussion there is among countries and with national human rights institutions, regulatory bodies and NGOs as well, the easier it will be to find the right way of ensuring that human rights are part and parcel of the implementation of the DSA, which, by the way, I think will be necessary to assess and adapt on a regular basis, because the digital world, better than I do, evolves much more rapidly than the legislative and regulatory one. So I think the more countries will use their legal arsenal and the cooperation with different stakeholders, the better. And I agree with Mathieu. Already the DSA has been an example of cooperation and public consultation. I think that also in the implementation of the DSA and on the designing of the measures that can help link human rights to the whole DSA issue, I think that is also a crucial part where member states agree to be transparent and cooperative with their own national structures as well, not only international.
Thank you. Tobias, I see you moving your pencil. Do you want to take the floor?
Thank you, Alexandra. I think that's an extremely important point. And why is it so? I couldn't agree more to everything that Matthew said. And I think, as I said, we are, as media regulators in the member states and over the IAGA, strongly supporting this idea of a European solution. And that's why we try to protect the European institutions to do a functional mistake. And I have a deep understanding why we have this suggested structure, but I also have got to underline very clearly that this structure in that way we have it now in the DSA won't work. And I can explain it very simply. And as I am representing the next executive body, it's not up to us to decide. But if you would like to reach this objective, to find an effective, efficient, and balanced system, then please take this point. And the reason is the following. The authority I'm responsible for at the moment has identified in the last 8 months 10,000 cases of legal infringement online. 2,000 of them are cross-border cases. So it's 20%. If you now take the number 2,000 just for the German market, and if you make it very simple, try to take this on the European perspective, then you can say that we will have minimum 10,000 cross-border infringement cases of media law in the European Union. The idea to bring this 10,000 cases via the media regulator to the digital services coordinator, to the digital services board, to discuss every one of these cases between 27 members is not possible. And even it is not necessary. Why? Because we have already a system, as I said at the beginning, all of these cases are just bi or maximum trilateral. We do not have pan-European cases. So in all these cases, we already have a solution in between the media regulators organized by the IAGA. It's the so-called Memorandum of Understanding. So we have clear rules in between us. That means in the most of these cases, of course, my first address is the Irish regulator. I don't know why, but it is like this. And the main work is to find a solution in between the German and the Irish media regulator, or between us and the French colleagues, like we have done in the past also very often, or the Luxembourg colleagues. And in between us to find solutions, to find also a way where we can involve the platform to use the system of trusted flagger on the one hand and legal execution on the other is something that starts to work. And at the moment, this is from our perspective, not only the German regulators, but all the media regulators' perspective, the only way to bring this mass of cases under control. So if we add now an additional layer of digital services board for this kind of cases, I'm just talking about this area, then I can guarantee you that we will have a decrease of effectiveness and efficiency for protecting the population. And this will generate questions where I just say upfront, I won't answer it as a politician, because the idea of the DSA, I agree, and I think the system in general is good, but I'm really asking for the very simple idea: use the structures you already have and use additional structures like the Digital Services Board just for the kind of cases where you need this complexity. And I'm sure there are cases like this. The power of platforms, where we are talking about the real, cross-sectoral questions and so on. This is something that we have got to give on the European level, and where we have to have this idea of a digital services board and an involvement of the European Commission, for sure. But the daily business of regulation, and I can only talk for the media regulator, I don't know how the situation is for our colleagues at the telecommunication sector or competition law, but for the media regulators, I can say very clearly, we are on a way to solve the problem. We are talking and working together with our European colleagues also to implement tools of artificial intelligence, to identify cases, to develop a platform in between us to exchange these cases. But to execute it, we've got to have fast ways and quick ways in between the different member states. This will be also the answer for the question how to proceed with the country of origin principle. This will be also the answer for the question how to guarantee state independency for media regulators. So that's why, coming back to your question, this governance structure at the moment is the answer to a very special kind of case where you need the competences of different regulatory perspectives. And for this area, this governance structure of the DSA for sure is fantastic. But for the daily business, and this is at the moment also involved, for the daily business of a sectoral regulation that we still have and will have in future, this is not an answer, this is an additional burden. And that's why, coming back to Article 69, we are so much insisting on thinking about to find a very, how to say, a tailor-made solution for this area to support the idea of this pan-European approach and to support the idea of the DSA. And I hope that this very practical example can help to understand our concerns.
Thank you, Tobias. Mathieu, France has been doing some very extensive capacity building lately. Our new super media regulator is turning 26 days old today. Can you tell us a bit about the rationale behind it and also what tools were put in place to make sure that the newborn ARCOM will be up to the challenges set by the DSA?
Thanks. I can say a word about ARCOM, but I think I'd like to come back to the very clear explanation from Tobias earlier, and probably state once again that I think the DSA is clearly delineating the accountability principles for a number of platforms, and the architecture of governance from the DSA. And if that needs to be clarified at some point, it will, but I think has been clarified a few times by the Commission, is not designed to address the day-to-day content by content issues, but the deficiencies from the platforms to tackle these issues. So the systemic approaches. So I think it's extremely important that in the system, the removal of hate speech content on one content specifically, that remains in the hands of a judge or an authority, depending on the framework, but it remains something that is addressed elsewhere in the DSA, but it's not going to come into the DSA's hand or in the board or anything. I don't think that's indeed going to work or be efficient, and that's, I believe, not the plan at all. We need to look at the DSA governance architecture as something to supervise that the platforms are setting the right systems, processes, accountability measures in place. There's a number of measures about audit systems and so on, in order that they're getting their acts together, and they can't just say, as they are saying in some cases right now, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't have, it was too costly, or I didn't have that many people speaking your language. That's the problems we're trying to solve, and obviously the architecture that is being designed cannot withstand the flow of individual cases, which should not get into this. And to come back to your question, Alexandra, I think that's really the idea we have been building in France, and that's just an example. Not pretending that this is the overall overarching model at all, but there were several steps taken from a regulator, CSA, which was focused on audiovisual, but also on content, on media content. There was a law regarding fake news, where their new competence has not been about recognizing what is fake news or not fake news. That is not the purpose, but assessing whether social networks are putting in place the right systems and processes in order to limit the spread of fake news. We have had as well recently another set of regulation that is widely inspired by the DSA regarding hate speech. There will be obviously competence as well regarding the terrorist content in application of the TCO regulation, where it's not the intent to ask this regulator to look content by content and assess whether it's legal or illegal. It's their role to go and supervise whether the platforms do set the right mix of human resources, technical resources, processes in place to limit the impact. And that's really been in France our approach in many of those cases. And we think this should be quite consistent with what is currently being considered by within the DSA. And I think the distinction is important because the individual issues we can still tackle through the existing local processes, because we need them to be efficient, expedient. They need to react very fast, and it cannot go through a multi-layer approach of governance. Hope that answers your question, Alexandra.
Perfectly so, thank you. You've mentioned illegal hate speech, and I would like to have Stephanie's view on the fact that there's a bit in the council text that refers to a commitment to process a majority of valid notification for the removal of illegal hate speech in less than 24 hours. And so, Stefano, I'd like to know what are the views of the Commissioner on these timeframes to remove illegal content hotline and their implication for freedom of expressions?
Well, there is a huge implication, of course. I mean, I understand that this time frame has been decided, agreed by the Commission and the private companies. There's also an interesting judgment, decision by the Conseil constitutionnel in France, where precisely this issue has been dealt with. And I think it really depends more on the time frame. It depends on the content, on the nature, and on the intent of the of the content that should be reviewed, because you can have clearly illegal content, and that you can take down that content quite easily and rapidly. But then in 24 hours, more complex decisions are difficult to be taken when you have to assess, to appreciate the legality or not of a particular content. I mentioned earlier that the content can be legal in a country, not in another, but the content can be legal per se, but illegal because of the context. For example, revenge porn. That's an example that comes to my mind. It could be part of a wider crime or not part of a wider crime, and you don't really, you cannot have a one solution for all these kind of contents. So I think it is not for, of course, the Office of the Council of Commissioner for Human Rights to decide whether the time frame is appropriate or not. I think in France there is now an interesting jurisprudence, but my wish is that, as also the Council of Europe has underlined, is that rather than focusing on the time frame, we should focus on the content, on the nature of that content, the intent of that content. Whether or not the DSA is the appropriate structure to deal with this, I don't know. I think there are situations in which it can be easily dealt at national level more effectively. And actually, human rights protection is all about implementing at national level the standards. But I think the interesting part of the DSA is also this horizontal relationships between the users and the private companies, which perform the public functions, of course, but there's no longer this vertical relationship only in the implementation of these standards. So it's important that there is a supervision on the processes and on the systems put in place by private companies. But since there is an horizontal relationship, I think that a key point is also what kind of remedies people have to challenge a decision by a private company to take down content. So again, I'm not sure the time frame is the real issue here. The time frame, the real issue to me is the what kind of safeguards are there in place to ensure that law enforcement is not privatized, and that private companies do not have the arbitrary decision to decide what is free speech and what is not free speech. So there are certainly many problematic open questions in regards to the implementations of these, these rules by private companies. I know that there is jurisprudence in the European Court of Justice, which also left a bit open discussion on the case Google against Spain. From the Council of Europe perspective, and the commissioners in particular, we have advocated for this kind of analysis of the content, the intent of the content, and trying to making sure that people have access to remedies, because otherwise it will be a huge temptation to use regulations to stifle dissent, freedom of expression, etc.
Thanks, Stefano. I'm sure the question has been addressed in the various working groups that you've had, Tobias, either at the ERGA level during your time as chair, or in the at the German level. How do you think that this should be addressed specifically, the question of these safeguards?
Yeah, I think this is one of the most complicated questions, and I agree to the perspective of Stefano that, on the one hand, and we have in Germany, as you know, the experience out of the NetzDG, we have, how to say, seen that there is a need to generate a kind of pressure to the industry to get active. This is also our impression as regulatory authorities, not only by the legislator, but on the other side, indeed, you have always the risk that then you set the industry instead of the judge. And this is especially in this balanced question between protection of core values like human dignity, what we are talking about in the area of hate speech, and freedom of expression, not that easy to say. So that's why my sympathy, or our sympathy, is increasing to say maybe we, and this is of course not already in the DSA, and maybe it's also too complicated, but just as an idea, I think it is an area where we've got to think about a system of, so to say, hybrid regulation. That means that you've got maybe to combine obligations to the industry that they have got to fulfill by their own standards, but at the same time, how to say, to say it very simple, 2 red lines, to say there is an area of content where the industry has got to fulfill this 24-hour obligation to say this is so clear and a violation of law that you've got to get active and you've got to implement a system to guarantee this. But on the other side, and another red line to say there are also kinds of content where you can get active because we have got to protect this freedom of expression. And maybe and I think that's a little bit, as I understand Stefano, we've got to think about if we could guarantee that this systematic approach of the industry is, how to say, is that this lays under a kind of supervision. So that's why I say hybrid regulation. You know, we as regulator, of course, especially in this area of freedom of expression, it's nearly impossible to take every case, of course. But maybe it could make sense to say, yes, but someone has got to have the supervision if the system works. So if there is a systematically mistake on side of the industry or not. And to be honest, again, here I would say, let's take structures, they are independent enough from states to make the supervision. And maybe this is, again, a good role for either national regulatory authorities, or if you are, how to say, too skeptical to the different member states, then maybe it's something to bring up to ERGA. So that's why I think for this very special area, and this is really complicated, for this very special area, I would say maybe the answer is in between the idea of, how to say, the old idea of regulation, and on the other side, a pure, how to say, the pure idea to give all the responsibility up to the industry and say, how to, you've got to see how to handle, and then we will see what we'll do. So that's why maybe the idea could be something, I don't know if this was also the idea of Stefano, but as far as I understood, to combine this more systematically obligation to the industry with a supervision of the systematic function. This is something that we have now also in the German media law for another area. There it's about transparency and non-discrimination. There we also, the German legislator says, it's not up to the media regulator to take an investigation of every single case, but it is up to the regulator to take care that there is a system implemented on the platform level that guarantees a non-discriminatory abuse or use. And if we have doubts on that, then we go into an investigation. And as I said, not case by case, but just take the cases as a first signal that there is systematically something wrong. So I think this combination could make sense because, you know, self-regulatory approaches without any risk of escalation normally don't work. It is like it is, or they work, but not in every case. So we have got to find solutions where if you have 99% good acting industry, then someone has got to take care for the 1% that doesn't work, also in the interest of industry. This is the one point. And on the other side, maybe this is again a solution to say, okay, and who should do so? And I think here we have got to be again aware that we are talking about media content, and that's why we need independency from states. And maybe we can use the European approach over the ERGA, the regulatory authorities group on the European level, to guarantee that we have an, how to say it very politely, and look that is generated by more than one view, because as you know, also member states are sometimes a little bit different.
Thank you. Mathieu, you had warned me in advance that you had to leave at 3 sharp, so I'll give you the opportunity to react. And also, then I will ask you a very last question that was just asked on the chat for you, and I will let you be free.
So just to react, to say that the focus on enforcement is absolutely critical. We're all going to celebrate the day we have a DSA, it comes into force. This is great. We're going to shake hands, have pictures, translate it into whatever number of languages. This is great. But unless we have credible enforcement mechanisms, this is not going to change a thing. And we know there's a long track record, including of sanctions in other areas, where we get big announcements and nothing really changes years after that. So the goal we must set ourselves to in the DSA is to have a real enforcement system. This means, and that's echoing, I mean, I'm fully in line with what Stefano and Tobias were saying on this. This means we need to provide the regulators, whoever they are, whatever, whether at the European level, national level, with eyes. They need to be able to monitor, and this means, in this case, some access to data that they don't have right now. And so we need to be very offensive, very ambitious there. So being able to oversee means having access to a lot of information from the platforms themselves. And we need to have real teeth. We need to be able to have sanctions that not only are significant. I think the text sets a good ambition there, but also that can be made effective pretty fast, because it's an iterative process, this regulation, and it has if the cycle is too long, then we'll be always chasing the tail of the platforms way too far behind to be effective. So I think these aspects are absolutely critical. That's been a significant part of the discussions in the council so far. So I'm confident everyone's really aligned to make sure this happens.
Thank you, Mathieu. And one last question from me. Well, actually not from me, but from Mr. Miro Guccini, who is a consultant at Flint Global. He wanted to ask you a question. Is the council willing to look at more comprehensive bans on targeted advertising in the DSA beyond the ban on targeted advertising for minors?
Well, one thing is for sure on that. It's going to be a topic of discussion in the trilogues, because the Parliament has put some proposals forward, and the concept of the trilogue is to try and reconcile the position. So obviously, it's too recent to have any insights to share about what the position of the council will be, but that's going to be a topic of discussion. We understand it's of significant importance from the European Parliament. There's been a lot of debate about it. It's also a highly discussed topic in other files, in other dossiers in Brussels that have been open for a while. I'm thinking about the e-privacy regulation, for instance. So we'll see how it moves, but it's going to be one of the interesting topics to monitor within the trilogue for our side, but on your side, I guess, from the outside. Certainly exciting discussions.
Well, thank you, Mathieu. I set you free for your afternoon. Looking forward to seeing you in Brussels, whether it snows or rains, according to you. And we'll see you soon.
Thank you very much. And sorry to have to leave early, and enjoy the rest of the discussion.
Thank
Cheers.
you. I had a few other items on my list I wanted to discuss with you. The first of which is trusted flaggers. It has been a thorough discussion, especially in the latest version of the text in the Parliament. Who can be a trusted flagger? How can we ensure that any challenges in terms of fundamental rights and protections, due process, etc., can be addressed also by the DSCs? So maybe, Stefano, do you see any issue or topic that should be, carefully looked at with this?
Yes, I think many of the things that we have already said in terms of, in particular, the necessity to strike the right balance between the different rights, conflicting rights at stake is one issue. How do we ensure that these trusted flaggers are appointed through a transparent process? How do we ensure that they are accountable? All the questions related to freedom of expression also are relevant to the work of these trusted flaggers. Basically, the question is, who are they? How are they appointed? What kind of remedy is there also for users to challenge their decisions? To me, it's still not really clear how they will work, and the aim is clear, but the way they will be appointed, and it's a bit less transparent to me. So I think there will be the need also to put strict and clear, precise limits to the work they are doing, avoiding that they become an overlapping structure on the many that we have already.
Thank you. Tobias, have you had that discussion internally within, the sphere of future DSCs, and is there a position?
Our discussion was not so much focused on the question how we should proceed for this trusted flagger. It's an interesting question for sure, and I agree that at the end the answer is simple. We've got to have a transparent procedure, and we have clear rules. My experience out of the practice is that this is not a big issue. So I've learned that in contact to the platforms we have in our market here, and always if I got in contact with them to ask for this trusted flagger approach, it was a normal procedure. It was very clear structured and it worked. So maybe we can put it also in law so that we have the guarantee also in the relationship to others, but it don't seem for me to be a core problem. We have another issue with this question of trusted flaggers, and this is the following. First, this whole idea of trusted flagging and procedure is at the end not the answer of our real question. Our real question is that we have a situation where we have a fantastic new opportunity. We call it internet. And of course, we have violation of law. And this violation of law is not done by platforms. It is done by individuals. If we just flag content, and if this content is just deleted, then the active person or individual is not learning that they are acting illegally. And that leads to two critical results. The first is, if society does not learn that there are also some rules in the online world, then we won't have an, educative aspect. And the second, and this is the bigger issue, it pays on the story of conspiracy between media and states, and that opinions are that if you don't have the right opinion, then you don't have a chance to make it open, because it is necessary that people, for example, using political extremism in a case in an area of violation of law, acting against human dignity and so on, have got to learn that this is illegal, and that's why we have got to enforce the law against them. At the same time, we've got to take care that this is not always public and so on, and therefore the trusted flagger status is helpful. But this is our experience. At the end, we can only change the situation we have at the moment in the online world abusing this freedom if you also educate population on a very balanced way that the freedom of expression has some rules, and this rule says you've got to respect the law even if you are acting in this area of freedom of expression. So it's not easy, as it always was, as it also wasn't easy in the past. And of course, at the door of my authority is the claim committed to freedom of expression, and I strongly believe in that. But if we would like to protect freedom of expression, we have also to guarantee that the rules to protect the weaker ones, the minors and so on, that they are respected, and therefore the trusted flagger system and deleting of content is not the answer, because we have got, and that leads to the following question, and of course this is one of, from my personal view, one of the weaknesses of the DSA. I know this is the political will, but that leads to the question of liability, because at the end someone is liable for the fact that we have an illegal action, and in the best case, of course, I get the person, because the person or the individual is acting. But someone has got to take care that we can come to this point. and not only are making, how to say, an interesting cascading system of liability that takes for an authority like mine 2 years to execute one example, as we do at the moment in the area of protection of minors. So that's why, coming from the area of hate speech, we have this trusted flagger collaboration from the German authorities with the most of the platforms, and it works. So that's why I think, yeah, it makes sense to have some clear rules, but it's not a big issue. That's my experience. And I'm also grateful for the very collaborative behavior of the industry on that. But at the same time, we have implemented in Germany a system that we say, and every case is not only flagged, but also given to the state prosecutors and to the police to take care that we also have an enforcement of law. And again, not because I'm so, how to say, focused on enforcing law, but I think that if we don't do this step also, then at the end, it is a question of freedom of expression. And just if you allow to me, you know, we have in Germany at the moment a very intensive discussion about Telegram. And the Telegram is something where we've got to get active. And you know, this discussion is the point that I'm afraid on. Because if you don't have an effective way to get active against the people that are acting illegally, then there is a high level of risk that the public opinion is going in a direction to say, okay, we've got to get active against the whole platform. And the whole platform means thousands and thousands of legal contents. And that's why I think that's a normal mechanism of political discussion, but it's really dangerous, because at the end, we've got to take care that we, at the same time, have this freedom of expression as a core idea of democracy in our minds. But if we do not find answers against the illegal behavior, then this system of freedom of expression will get under pressure. And that's why it's so important to find answers here. And therefore, I'm afraid the flagging system is not the end of the answer. It is one part, and I like it, but it's not the answer.
Thank you. That was extremely clear. And of course, the actual enforcement needs to be well taken care of. And we actually got a question in the chat. By the way, drop your questions in the chat and we'll try to answer all of them. But that comes back to this question of trusted flagger from a branch, you know, that is very keen on flagging, but also working very closely with law enforcement to act on this illegal goods. And I'm referring here to manufacturers, and we have a very interesting question by Jamin Patel from LVMH. They ask, in the case of illegal goods, manufacturers would be in the best place to be trusted flaggers. Do you see any problems with their inclusion? I don't know who would like to take the floor first. I will need to start pointing fingers. Okay, thank you, Stefano.
No, I mean, it makes sense. The question is how, I mean, Tobias said very well that there is a cooperation in Germany between the state authorities and private sector on certain topics. I'm not sure whether this is the case in other countries. So I think in that sense, the DSA could be useful. It's not, of course, for the Council of Europe to say whether the manufacturers should be included or on certain systems. It seems logical to me. At the same time, linking this gives me the opportunity to link it to another issue and to what Tobias was saying. I think that it is extremely important to make sure that the content which is clearly legal, which is part of a broader crime, etc., be prosecuted. And by deleting the contents, the story is not over. But sometimes it is, because private companies, in particular bigger, the big companies, they hide behind data protection rules. And if you don't get access to that data, it's very difficult to prosecute and to make awareness, of course, but to go to the real person responsible for that. And this is a huge issue. In some cases, it is easier, but in others, definitely it's a place where there are again conflicting interests between freedom of expression, data protection. So, I mean, it is probably necessary to have in the enforcement to have a discussion on how best countries can go with that, what kind of cooperation there can be between national authorities and the private sector. And again, I'm not sure that all countries are well equipped to do this kind of work.
Thank you. Tobias, you raised your hand right after Stefano took the floor, so I assume that you have a view on this.
Yeah, but I can be on this point. I think I can be much shorter. It depends. So if we are talking about how to say a more civil law perspective between companies abusing brands, for example, and things like that, yeah, maybe that's not my cup of tea. For the public communication, I would like to say, you know, this is again the same point as we have discussed before, and I think I again agree to Stefano that we've got to take care that no one is abusing the possibility of a trusted flagger, and that it brings also the platforms in a very complicated situation. So that's why I would say, as long as we are talking about questions of competition law, brand, and economic aspects, I don't know, maybe. But as far as we are talking about the idea of public communication and again freedom of speech and expression, I'm very skeptical to give too many institutions the possibility to intervene as trusted flaggers, because as I said at the end, if there are any doubts, then first of all we have freedom of expression, and that leads again to one discussion that we also have had in the European Parliament at the end of the last week. How to proceed with content that is obviously already regulated and it is approved, so to say, as media content, and why should there be a kind of a second control? I know that the answer to this is extremely complicated, but the question is also something that I understand. And here we have an additional aspect. You know, this is a case there you will find different answers depending from the question about which member state are you talking? Are you talking about the more or less stable democratic approved system that we have in some of the European areas, or are we talking about other systems, to be again very polite? So, but this was not the question, so that's why the question that was asked out of the chat, I would say, as long as we are not talking about public communication in the sense of freedom of expression, it's up to the industry, do whatever you want. And in the moment where we are reaching this area of freedom of speech and expression, I would say I would be very careful how to involve in this trusted flagger status, because I think this should be up to either media regulators or the courts to decide.
Thank you. We have received another question from Kieran. The question is, if the internet existed a couple of 100 years ago, the argument of the earth was round would have been one that could have been classed as fake news. When looking at the DSA and in the current global pandemic, will reviews be set by facts? And how will we monitor what one person sees as fake news? Tobias, please.
Yeah, that's right. And you know, this fake news discussion is something where I'm also not that optimistic that we could solve it by prohibitions. It is like it is. And you know, this is more my personal opinion, because we do not have an official position of ERGA to that. First of all, I strongly believe that democracy has got to tolerate a lot of interesting aspects, ideas, and news. The only thing I do not like is the abuse by the name or image or other aspects of authorities that generates that this opinion is, how to say, a serious fact. Like, for example, if it comes from how to say, journalistic content providers, or from state institutions, or from scientists. of scientists. And that's why I think the answer against fake news normally could be more a question of transparency, who is saying that, and not so much a question of prohibitions, because I'm afraid that in most cases of truth, it's not easy to find the real truth answer. And and especially it is very clear that neither we as media authorities nor any other legal institutions I know can do the job as a kind of truth authority. So that's why I think to find answers for this area of fake news, I deeply believe in the idea of first, transparency, and second, how to say, this idea of journalistic standards. You can say whatever you want, but if it's an opinion, sign that it's an opinion. If you're asking people, you also have got to ask for the second opinion, and so on. Things like that. I think this is learned in the past, broadcasting newspapers and radio, and it worked more or less. And now we have got to see if we can implement it also in the online world, something that we try at the moment in Germany. But again, we are not an institution to check truth, and no one else is it at the moment. And I think prohibitions in this area are very difficult. That's why I think the answer would be more a matter of transparency.
Thank you. I don't know, Stefano, you wish to react to that?
Yes, very briefly. I think this is a very important field of action in the future, because there are a number of countries criminalizing disinformation, and I think this is extremely dangerous from a point of view of human rights, and in particular freedom of expression. There are other ways, as Tobias was saying, to deal with disinformation, with misinformation, with malinformation. There are different aspects of that topic. But in terms of the DSA, to come back to that act, I think it would be crucial to be sure that the intent is also assessed. For example, the intent of an internet provider might be to use this information to make money. And there we have clashes between the business model and human rights. If the business model is to get money by promoting information, I wouldn't say information, disinformation that we know produces more clicks, then it is important that state regulators or European level regulators can get immediate action by the provider. If that doesn't happen, I think there must be a responsibility established also for that provider. So it is an extremely complex field, because there is also state disinformation. And I tend to agree with Tobias. I mean, the position of the Commission is clear on that as well. We'd better avoid criminalizing disinformation, because it entails more risks than benefits. And there are other ways of ensuring that the debate is open, and you can flag and say, this is an opinion, this is not really a good information. There are fact checkers as well. The problem that I see is that, yeah, I tend to agree with the PS2 as well. I'm not really optimistic, because this information is as old as humankind. And the platforms now are making this incredibly easy to spread also in an anonymous way. But yeah, I think the DSA should also have an impact on how platforms react to this problem.
Thank you. Tobias, please.
Yeah, and I think, to make this absolutely clear, I won't like to minimize this problem of fake news, disinformation, and so on. I think this is one of the core challenges our society has got to face at the moment. But nevertheless, as that's my job, I've got to underline that we've got to just think first what we are doing, because talking about having strange opinions, even say wrong things, it's not illegal. So, and we've got to be very careful that we do not go into an, how to say, you know, I try to make an example. After the first terror attacks in Europe, I was traveling to Brussels, and I was really, how to say, irritated and feeling insecure because of all the soldiers on the train stations and the airports. And my first thought was, okay, the first objective of the terrorists is reached, because now we are acting against our own freedom. And we have got to do so. That's nothing against this actions. So I tell you this example because it's a little bit like our fake news and disinformation discussion. We have got to be careful not to destroy what we try to protect. And the really, how to say, complicated or maybe also irritating or more aspect of disinformation is abusing the core idea of a democratic society. Freedom of expression and so on is used to destabilize exactly the same society that is generating this value. And this is really difficult because if you are acting against disinformation, it is like a little bit an operation on the open heart of democracy. And that's why I think I just would like to underline, I think we've got to be really careful if we are talking about answers on that topic. So we've got to find answers, but I think a big area of disinformation is an area where we've got to find an answer coming out of society and out of the political discussion and not so much out of law. What we can on the legal side do is to think about, okay, which area is something where we can get active and have an objective standard. Because at the moment where you get subjective in your standard, then it's obvious that you also have your own opinion on that, and that you have good and bad content, and there you've got to be careful as a regulator. And what can be objective? I think objective standards is always the case if it's not, if, for example, the content is not only wrong or right, but maybe it is not clear who's addressing this content, or if it is not clear that this content is, how to say, the relevance of the content is not authentic. So for me, for example, the area of coordinated inauthentic behavior, as an example, is something where I would say, okay, this is something where we can think about as a regulator. Because here we are not talking about the question if the content is wrong or right, good or bad, but the inauthentic, the coordinated inauthentic behavior generates the impression that this content has relevance. And that generates the impression in the population, oh, okay, now we have all this opinion or that opinion. And this is something where the manipulation is up to the techniques, and it's not related to the question if the content is good or bad. So I try to, it's very complicated, I know, and it's maybe not the core topic, but it's something where I really believe that we have got to discuss the answers and at the same time have got to be careful, because we are talking about something that is very close to the core idea of a democratic media society. I'm so sorry for my more emotional answer.
I think you've touched on very important parts. So on the contrary, thank you for the long and detailed answer. So as you know, being a moderator just means being a very glorified alarm clock. We still have 6 minutes in our conversation, so I would like to each give you 1 or 2 minutes, not more than 3, to give me your last words of wisdom and advice for the next discussions, and then it'll slowly come time to wrap up the discussion. I don't know. Well, Stefano, it's your turn, please.
Well, thank you. I think it would be difficult to give one piece of advice in this sense. I think the discussions have been quite rich. I think the key point here is, honestly, in the future, the discussion to make sure that there is no unique private enforcement of the law, and we cannot leave this in the hands of private companies to regulate what is legal content, what is a remedy, etc. The state must have must have the last word. And there are so many topics that we have discussed that it's it's almost impossible to sum up all of them. But the necessity is to make sure that what is legal and illegal offline, it is also online, and vice versa, because we have to have legal certainty on these issues, and that will be a challenge, I think, in the coming years.
Thank you, Tobias.
Yes,
I hate to say any last words, but you get the point.
No, I think for the upcoming discussion for the DSA, I think the most important thing from our perspective is to get back in mind, you know, it seems to be that complicated, but at the end it isn't. And don't go into this complexity trap. You know, yes, we have digitalization and globalization, yeah, but nevertheless, at the end, we are talking about securing 4 or 5 core values: human dignity, protection of minors, pluralism, and consumers. That's it. And therefore, we have already a lot of tools, we have authorities, and we only have got to find answers, to find collaboration in between member states, and Europe is a good address to send it. So that's why I would say everyone is doing its job. Legislation is writing rules, industry is filling it out, and the regulators are taking care that it works at the end. And everyone can do, if everyone does its job, then I'm quite sure that we will reach it. And as I said at the beginning, and that's important for the DSA, that's why we are clear addressing that it could be a good idea to use existing structures instead of taking the complexity trap. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you. So as I said earlier, this has been the last event of our Ideas in Focus series of events. I really like this one personally. So thank you so much for joining us today. You'll find very soon the recording of this event and a recap of this event on our website. And so we wish all of you panelists and public a very successful discussions, because the work is far from done. And please stay tuned also to on the Eurispa website to check for future events such as this one. Thank you so much, and I wish you a lovely afternoon. Goodbye.
Thank you, Alexandra.
Thanks.
Thank you, Tobias. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.